Draw the curtains and expand your mind. It's time to get textual as we traverse the illicit pages of Wrongthink in the Forbidden Book Club.
Yes, indeed. It's my favorite part of the program. It is the Forbidden Book Club. As I've confessed to you before, I'm bookish. I'm a book nerd. I find nothing more pleasing. Well, that's not strictly true, but it's one of the highlights of my life is spicy literature. And today I'm going to bring you something pretty spicy. Now, before we get into that, because I imagine that today's topic is, well, it might potentially upset some people. So what I'm engaging in today, when I talk about this book today, Death Object, it's called Death Object, reasonably obscure book. I am going to be engaging in speculation. I think speculation is a good thing. I think wrestling with difficult, problematic concepts is something that broadens the mind, gives you certain intellectual elasticity. And I think that you, the audience, are adult enough to engage in speculation, to test the waters of the literary and intellectual ocean, to dip your toe in and to see what you think of things. So what I'm presenting today is highly speculative, but I think very, very interesting. And I'm going to be talking primarily about this book, Death Object, Exploding the Nuclear Weapons Hoax. Now, this book, I highly recommend it. I think it's a very interesting book. I class it as speculative, but I think there are some very, very interesting underlying principles here. It is supposedly written by this fellow, Akio Nakatani. When I first read this book, which is a few years back now, I assumed that was a pseudonym, but I'm not sure that it is. But that was my assumption. I went searching around the other day, there is a Japanese fellow of that name. In fact, there's a couple. So it may be quite a common name in Japan. I don't know. But there is one who roughly fits the biography that's presented in the back of this book. He's presented as a sort of high-level physics and mathematics professor. There is somebody in Japan who somewhat matches that biography. I don't know if it's exactly the same person or not. I have no real way of knowing. Like I said, I assumed this book was written at the time that I read it a number of years ago under a pseudonym, but I'm not sure one way or the other. But we're going to wrestle with some spicy concepts, and we're going to engage in speculation. Please come along. Enjoy the ride. You might enjoy yourself. Now, the first, I wanted to set the scene for discussing this actually really quite fascinating book by talking about something that I call, and I'm not sure, maybe other people have discussed this concept, they probably have, but I call it the architecture of fear. I call it, you could also call it the biosphere. I think we have a little graphic of that there somewhere, Ed. And I've talked about this briefly before, but I think it's really, really important. And I know, many of you will have come to similar realizations organically yourselves, simply because of the times that we live in. But what I describe as the architecture of fear is this sort of environment, this ecology where the malevolent powers of the state and the media, forgive me, I repeat myself, they appear to me very clearly to have a strategy of constantly, and this has been going on for decades at least, decades and decades, at least, of they appear to have a strategy of continually and perpetually bombarding the public with fear. There's always something that the public needs to be afraid of at any given moment. Isn't that interesting? If you have, the most basic understanding of psychology, and don't take my word for it, do your own research, but you will realize that frightened people are more likely to be obedient and subservient to authority. This is a very well established psychological precept and a concept. Frightened people are much more likely to be obedient to authority. They're more likely to place their trust in authority when they are frightened, and they seek the protection of authority to protect them from, the bears in the woods, the things that are out there that they are frightened of. In fact, it's part of the social contract, isn't it? That the state promises to protect you from the bears in the woods, the hobgoblins, the bogeyman that's out there if you cede some of your wealth, for example, and some of your rights to the state. That's part of the social contract, that it promises to protect you from those things. So I think that concept that the more frightened people, fear drives people into the arms of authority. It drives them into the arms of the state. And if you've been around for as long as I have, or less, or longer, you may well have noticed that there's always something to be frightened of. The media is always pumping out this fear narrative. Now, when I was a kid, it was the Cold War. It was this, not hot, supposedly, but Cold War between the West and the East, between, essentially the US and its satellite states, and the Soviet Union and its satellite states. The Cold War. That was this time, for many, many decades, basically from the end of the Second World War, from 1945 up until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, we were told and we were indoctrinated to be terrified of the possibility of nuclear war. In fact, just to illustrate that, you would have noticed by now that I have an interest in history. I also have an interest in music. And I definitely have an interest where those two overlap, music and history. So, I have all these box sets about Cold War history. Here's one, Cold War music from the golden age of Homeland Security. It's a 10 CD box set or something, full of music, popular music, music that was on the hit parade, jaunty sing-along tunes about, many of them about nuclear destruction. Comes with this huge book. Atomic Platters is the name of the box set, in case you're interested. Comes with CD after CD, full of all sorts of historic recordings. There's recordings from 1945 onwards. Some of them pretty entertaining. Atomic Cocktail, Get That Communist Joe, Atomic Power, Atomic Baby, Atom Bomb Baby, Atomic Nightmare. These were all pop songs of the time that wrestled with this idea that we, the population, could be destroyed by a nuclear holocaust at any moment. And that's right. I mean, and there's all sorts of film ones as well. The mass media did its job, as it's always doing, which is to make people frightened and to divide them as well. But in this case, certainly frighten them. I mean, I remember this film The Day After. I've never actually seen it, but it was kind of huge. It got this huge push in the media when I was a kid. There was another film called War Game, which is an English one, which was about mass destruction in a nuclear war. There was Dr. Strangelove, of course, a sort of a comedy, really, about the end of the world in a nuclear apocalypse. There's Dr. Strangelove, a poster for Dr. Strangelove. Failsafe. I mean, there would be hundreds, if not thousands, of these artifacts from the Cold War era. My point is, this Failsafe was not a bad film, actually, but there was this mass campaign, I would argue, to terrify people throughout the Cold War about the prospect of what at some points was described as MAD, M-A-D, mutually assured destruction. That was a strategy, I think, developed by the Rand Corporation, in that both sides of this conflict would have enough nuclear weapons that they could annihilate each other, and therefore nothing would happen. It was also known as the nuclear stalemate. So my point is that I certainly grew up in this atmosphere of fear. My memory is that most children of my age quietly assumed that we would probably die in a nuclear war. In fact, I knew of a guy, my memory's a little bit sketchy on this, but my father was friends with a guy who conducted all this research and surveys about school children around Australia and how frightened they were of dying in a nuclear war. And he was actually disappeared as a political prisoner after conducting all that research. Anyway, that's another story. And then, there's all sorts of other scare rubrics, frameworks of fear. There was the global cooling. I can remember this being in scientific magazines when I was a kid. I think we might have Newsweek there and a few other things. I've noticed the waters have started to be muddied about this, but I distinctly remember global cooling as being something that you should be frightened about in my youth. Also, the hole in the ozone layer. Ed, if you've got... look, here we go. Here's Time magazine, a reliable source for propaganda at all times. If you want to see whatever nonsense they want you to believe at any given time, just go straight for Time magazine. They are very reliable in broadcasting propaganda. There's many more of those images there, Ed. If you want to bring some up, go right ahead. The hole in the ozone layer, that was something else that you were meant to be terrified of. It was going to lead to mass extinction on the Earth. Everyone was going to, fry into a crisp because this ozone layer would expand and the whole planet would basically burst into a ball of flame until, it didn't. And everybody forgot about it and moved on to the next thing. Then there was AIDS. I remember in the AIDS era that, there's more ozone layer nonsense from Nature magazine. Then there was AIDS. I think we've got that Grim Reaper ad image there somewhere, Ed. Everybody who there it is, the Australia. If you're not watching from Australia, you may not know this, but this was a big advertising campaign in Australia. The Grim Reaper was playing 10-pin bowls and knocking over people. Everybody supposedly who had sex at any time was going to die. Yes, I've mentioned this in previous episodes of All Out of Bubblegum. I won't go into it in too much detail. I'll simply note that this catastrophic decimation of the population didn't actually come to pass. Then there was 9/11, September 11. That was another thing. You had to be terrified of the terrorists, the handy, ever reliable Osama bin Laden would turn up at the most opportune moments. I noticed he always turned up just before elections, and cackled and delivered his frightening, evil, pronouncements just before election time. So you had to be terrified of the terrorists, and of course, just 3 years ago, not that long ago, there were this massive terrorist attacks everywhere, and ugly stuff. Don't get me wrong, ugly, horrible things happening to people. But I do note that when it began to be time to run the current operation in early 2020, ISIS or whatever nonsense thing took a holiday. They were all very frightened of catching the flu, and so they just gave up and went home. I would suggest that that's because psychologically speaking, as far as psychological warfare is concerned, you probably can't be trying to terrify people with too many things at once. It'll muddy the signal. It'll add too much noise to the signal. You've either got to be terrifying them of this thing or that thing. You can't be terrifying them of multiple things at once. I think they might actually just become catatonic and collapse. And then, there's the climate crisis and blah, blah, blah. My point being, there's always something you need to be terrified of. Now, the premise that's I'm trying to build a landscape there. The premise of this book, Death Object, Exploding the Nuclear Weapons Hoax, yes, you might have guessed it by the title. This fellow suggests in the strongest possible terms that nuclear weapons, by the laws of physics, cannot function. Nuclear energy can. You can generate energy from the controlled fission of nuclear compounds, but he argues, and he goes in depth in this book, actually, and I actually highly recommend it to you. He goes in depth and to the physics of nuclear weapons technology, and he argues from the laws of physics and from the laws of what we know from demonstration and experiments that nuclear weapons cannot function, that they are in fact a fraud, that they are, and he argues very strongly that they are a fraud designed to terrify the population and make them subservient, make them obedient. And I know what you're thinking. Well, what about the Soviets? What about the Russians and the Chinese and the blah, 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 blah? They must be into it as well. What I would argue, and he touches on this in the book, but I would go into more depth to a degree here. I would suggest that not only does fear send populations into the arms of authority, it makes them more obedient, but also if you have different factions of a ruling elite, they might, my speculation, they might recognize that they all have something to gain. They all have a shared interest. All of these blocks, all of these factions, and I choose that word very deliberately, factions can use fear to control their own domestic populations. And in fact, if you look at it under that rubric, you could think that actually the greatest enemy that exists for the ruling elite, the 0.001%, is the common folk, the common people, their domestic populations. I would argue, actually, Ed, if we could bring up Anthony Sutton. This fellow has written, yes, exactly, that's the one. National Suicide, Military Aid to the Soviet Union. Written by this fellow here, Anthony Sutton. He's written a bunch of interesting books. They're actually pretty good. I think from memory, National Suicide was written in the late 70s, or maybe mid to late 70s from memory. It's a pretty interesting book. And Sutton notes, and it's well researched, that there was a continuing program, a secret program, of exchanging, the US exchanging high technology, military technology, very high-end technology with the Soviet Union. And this exchange program had gone on secretly for decades. There's a lot of evidence for it. And that if the West, the US, and the Soviet Union were involved in this life and death struggle for supremacy and for victory, why on earth would the US be regularly and over the space of decades supplying the Soviet Union with high-end advanced weapons technology and other technologies too, and computer technologies, all sorts of things? Why would that be going on? There's another Sutton book called Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. It's here somewhere, but who knows exactly, but it's around here somewhere. That also, in that, Sutton also notes that there was an extraordinary amount of collusion and financing coming from Wall Street in the US that propped up and actually helped create the Soviet Union. He didn't quite, Sutton never quite got into what I would suggest is the larger setup there, and that is, as I alluded to earlier, that while the theatre show, while the show put on for the public was this life and death struggle between capitalism and communism, at a certain higher level, there was actually a lot of cooperation between capitalism and communism. And I would suggest one of the reasons for that, one of the motivations for that, is that the people running those higher levels of capitalism and communism were actually cooperating, and that they knew ultimately that their greatest enemies were the general population. Their greatest enemies were us, and that they had to use all sorts of measures to corral and control us. So in Death Object, he argues very strongly the physics argument that it's impossible for nuclear weapons to work. There is too much space in atoms, that there's massive amounts of space in atoms, and the idea that you can excite electrons and make them collide with each other, therefore, exploding and producing incredible amounts of energy. The chances of reaching a critical mass, the probability of being able to do that is remote to the point of being impossible. So he argues that by the laws of physics, nuclear weapons are not possible, but nuclear power technology is. He also argues that, and I know the other thing you're going to think, I think I know what you're going to think, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So this is where I went in pursuit of these ideas, because it struck me a number of years ago. It struck me exactly, Johan. There are inconsistencies in these stories. The keen eye will notice inconsistencies, and I also noticed. Well, I thought it odd that 2 nuclear weapons were dropped in anger in August 1945 on Japan. And a lot of people died, and I don't celebrate that one little bit at all. But I thought it was odd. I thought it was very odd in a historical context that 2 weapons were dropped on Japan in anger, and then for 75, 77, going on 80 years, no other nuclear weapons have ever been deployed in anger, ever, anywhere on the planet since. I find that very, very odd. Now, there are, the US, for example, and they're not the only country that supposedly has nuclear weapons. You had the Soviets, now the Russian Federation. You had the French, you had the English, you had China, you now have Pakistan, you have Israel, North Korea, supposedly. What are the odds that none of these countries have ever been tempted to use a nuclear weapon to settle a war, a battle, a dispute? The US, for example, has had Vietnam, which they lost. They've had the Korean War, which was a stalemate, technically. Would George Bush Sr. and Jr. not have been tempted to deploy small nuclear weapons in Iraq, for example? I find the idea that all of these leaders have been so responsible as to not be tempted to finish the argument with a decisive weapon, I find the probability of that to be very, very small. Now, interestingly, Ed, if you could bring up the book cover for Command and Control. Now, supposedly, it's written by a fellow called Eric Schlosser, I think. Command and Control is the name of the book. I believe there's a documentary of it as well. Schlosser, he catalogues a whole host, dozens and dozens of accidents with nuclear weapons where there was almost a nuclear weapons accident, a catastrophe, and that an entire city was almost nuked. And he's talking mainly about the US. He's talking about the Damascus incident and a number of other incidents, some of which are somewhat well known but not generally discussed. But these are where nuclear bombs have been dropped, or they've fallen off the back of a truck, or they've fallen off a train, or various other accidents have happened. And according to his thesis, we've come, within a hair's breadth of nuclear annihilation. But it's never actually happened. And there's been dozens and dozens of these accidents, which he catalogues in that book, Command and Control. But we've never had a nuclear weapon detonate accidentally, which I also find very unconvincing. Now, I know you're going to raise the argument about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In this book, Death Object, he argues reasonably persuasively that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed. That's true. But he argues, and other people have also argued, that nuclear weapons were not used at these places. This was a fraud. This was propaganda. Actually, mass bombing with napalm was used in Hiroshima. Actually, Ed, bring up those Hiroshima images again. They're interesting, actually, to look at. That photo here. Now, this is ground zero, apparently in Hiroshima. And I'm talking about Hiroshima because there's more photographic evidence there that I could find. So supposedly, the nuclear bomb was detonated, roughly speaking, 500 meters in the air above this building. So this is essentially ground zero in Hiroshima, apparently, according to the official narrative. That building should not be there if that nuclear weapon was detonated just 500 meters above it. There's no way that building should exist at ground zero, and yet it still does exist. I would also note, and Ed, you can pull up more photos of Hiroshima, that Hiroshima at the time, 1945, was, here we go, it was largely, it's been described as largely a sort of large fishing village. Most of the buildings were wood or paper. There was very few concrete buildings in Hiroshima. Most of those concrete buildings did survive the attack. I think that's very interesting. So what you're seeing there in this speculation is that buildings that were made of wood and paper were destroyed, but buildings made of concrete survived. If that nuclear weapon was detonated 500 meters above the ground, the theory is that for a couple of kilometers from ground zero, there should just be a huge crater, and that none of these concrete buildings would survive. Now, this looks remarkably similar to Tokyo. Tokyo was firebombed with napalm and phosphorus a couple of months before. I think it was in March 1945. Over 100,000 people died in Tokyo that night with the firebombing of Tokyo. Horrific events. I do not celebrate them in any way whatsoever. But if you look at photos, and I think we've got one somewhere there, Ed, if you look at photos of Tokyo after that firebombing, they look, for all intents and purposes, quite similar to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yes, that's Hiroshima again. That's a different angle of ground zero where that building has remarkably survived, even though a nuclear bomb has been detonated just above it. That is, I think that's Tokyo. Yes, I think that's Tokyo after the firebombing. Notice the similarity. All the wooden paper buildings are gone. They've been burnt because there was massive fire. All the concrete buildings have survived. I'm just going to draw your attention to that. I think that that is very, very interesting. I would also note, and this is just my observation, my personal observation, if you were planning to fake this mass nuclear weapons event for reasons that should be self-evident, you'd probably want to have a few trial runs with your napalm carpet bombing of cities with napalm. In fact, you'd probably want to have, over a couple of months, you'd probably want to have a couple of trial runs. Well, I would suggest here's one. Here's a trial run, The Destruction of Dresden. This book, can't really mention this book anymore. This fellow's persona non grata, but my father bought this book in Myers in Melbourne when I was a kid. This is his copy. Dresden in February of 1945, Dresden in Germany, between the 13th to the 15th of February 1945, was subjected to mass firebombing. Look, it's not clear how many people died. It was a horrific event. Some people suggest up to 200,000. Others suggest between 100 and 150,000. The official numbers, I think, around 50,000. Nobody knows exactly because of the mass destruction that was involved. I would suggest, just my theory, just my speculation, that this may have been a trial run. This, you will note, was followed a month later by the firebombing of Tokyo, the photos of which look remarkably similar, I would suggest, to Hiroshima. Now, you might say, yes, but I've seen the films of nuclear tests and the Trinity. Trinity was the first and only experimental test of a nuclear weapon before Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed. I'll just say that again, the first and only test of a nuclear weapon was Trinity in the US, the Trinity experiment. Supposedly Oppenheimer and these characters, if you know the history, supposedly they weren't sure that the critical mass in their nuclear explosion, that it might be unstoppable, it might not expend itself, and that in fact the entire planet might be destroyed. If you read the histories of the Manhattan Project and Oppenheimer and these fellows, they talk about this, that they weren't sure if their nuclear bomb experiment might in fact destroy the whole of creation, the whole of the planet. So if they actually genuinely believe that, what a remarkably irresponsible thing to do. But perhaps they didn't believe it. Anyway, yes, the films of the tests and so forth, and the photographs, yes, I understand. So let's have a look at some of these photographs. Here's one. This is just a frame. This in a few moments, this building will be destroyed in this incredible nuclear blast. Just look at that building for a moment. Now, in my youth, I was a bit of a war gamer. I built, model tanks and buildings and so forth. To my eye, this looks like a model. This absolutely looks like a model. And Ed, if you can pull through some of the A-bomb photos that are there as well. Here we go. Here's another one. That photo looks incredibly fake to me. Look at the sort of shading, the drop shadow around the sort of stem of the mushroom cloud. Apparently, massive amounts of TNT will also produce a mushroom cloud. That photo looks very, very fake to me. Look at this one. If you look at this photo in detail, if you try and blow it up a bit, there are all sorts of problems in this photo for my eye. The explosion looks like a painting to me. If you look at it up close, it really looks like a painting, that mushroom cloud to me. The cannon also looks like a model if you look up to it closely. And there are all sorts of focus range problems, the landscape, the sort of mud wall next to the cannon, the depth of field is all wrong there. I'm suggesting that that photo is also a fake. You've got a painting, you've got a model, you've got depth of field problems. It looks like a fake to me. There are others there too, Ed. Look at this one. This is supposedly from the Trinity blast in 1945, the experimental blast. That looks like a model to me. That sort of popcorny looking stuff down the bottom looks like foam to me, and that half sphere shape there looks like a model to me, or possibly a painting with a bunch of foam around the bottom. It does not look real to my eye at all. Going on further from that, and we may have other photos there. They all look fake to me. Now, that's right, a very angry pimple. Now, some of you may, and some of you may not have heard of a facility known as Lookout Mountain. Ed, could you pull up the blurb about Lookout Mountain? Lookout Mountain was a facility just outside Hollywood, actually, on the end of Laurel Canyon in Los Angeles. It was a secret. It was a secret Defense Department facility where they made and conducted all sorts of secret films for the US military and for the US state over a number of decades, commencing in the 40s and I think leading until the 70s. This was apparently, there's a massive amount of buildings under the ground level. And all sorts of actors, Marilyn Monroe and John Wayne and all these famous actors apparently acted in classified films that the Defense Department shot and edited and constructed at Lookout Mountain. And Lookout Mountain, this is from the official history. Lookout Mountain was the exclusive studio that shot and processed and developed all the films of all of the nuclear tests and all of the nuclear weapons technology. All of that footage and those photographs were done by the people at this secret facility, Lookout Mountain. I'm going to suggest to you that their job was to fake all that footage. All of that footage and all of those photographs is my speculation and the speculation in Death Object. I'm speculating that all of it is fake. And for the very, very simple reason to add to this fear rubric, the paradigm, the atmosphere of fear that you need if you want to keep your domestic population subservient at all times. You need them to be frightened at all times. There is another book. Sadly, I believe it's only available as a PDF. It's the Michael Palmer book, We Breathe the Gases as the Bombs Fell, I think it's called. You might be able to pull up the image, Ed. This book is written by a US doctor who argues from a medical standpoint that Hiroshima and the Nagasaki, neither of those were bombed with nuclear weapons. They were instead bombed with carpet bombing with napalm and mustard gas, which accounts for all of the fatalities that you see there. He argues in great depth from a medical point of view. He does not argue from as much from a propaganda or visual, photographs, etc., point of view. But he argues from a medical point of view that all of the injuries that you see are consistent with carpet bombing with napalm, as we saw in Tokyo and Dresden, and with mustard gas. And he also notes the huge number of survivors from Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Hundreds of thousands of people survived when, if you take the mainstream opinion on nuclear weapons, they should certainly not have survived. He also argues that nuclear power is nowhere near as dangerous as people are told, and that is also part of this rubric of fear that people need to be kept under. I want to show you another book. There's not much literature. This is, interestingly, while I want to mention, while there are all sorts of fringe ideas, some of which get a lot of push through the independent media and other channels, some very fringe ideas get a lot of airtime. They get a lot of oxygen. The idea that the whole paradigm behind nuclear weapons might in fact be fraudulent gets very, 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 very little. I find that very interesting. This is a book that touches on the issue by Simon Charles Smith, Fake Aliens and the Phony Nuke World Order. I realize the cover looks a little bargain basement. This book is actually excellent. It comes highly recommended from me. It's an excellent, excellent book. Simon Charles Smith, Fake Aliens and the Phony Nuke World Order. It's fairly spicy in places. If you're of a sensitive temperament, you might not want to dive in, but otherwise, if you are a courageous seeker of the truth and you're not frightened to grapple with speculative ideas that I cannot guarantee to you are 100% correct, but I still believe that it is perfectly fair and wise and judicious to entertain ideas that are difficult and challenging. This book I highly recommend to you. Here's more examples of propaganda. These are comics from the 50s, Nukem. They're all Cold War comics celebrating the end of the world. I mean, this was something that we were meant to be absolutely frightened of. Here's more music about it, single CD set of Cold War tunes. And I'm just going to finish with this. A very interesting book. As a teenager, I became quite obsessed with this writer, Philip K. Dick, and I read every single book that I could get of Philip K. Dick's, all of which I recommend to you. You may know him already. You may know some of the films that his books have inspired, like Blade Runner and Total Recall and these sorts of things. Blade Runner in particular, I think, is a great film, but his books are different and better. I read every single one that I could find at the time, and they weren't easy to find at the time. But this book, this is a mid-60s book, 64, 65, I think, from memory, The Penultimate Truth. It has a very interesting premise, which I never forgot after I read this book. In The Penultimate Truth, this work of science fiction from Philip K. Dick, who was a very clever guy, there's a huge nuclear war, huge nuclear cataclysm, and the population is driven underground to live in mass cities under the ground. I think from memory they were called ant tanks or ant hives or something like this. So millions of people have perished on the surface in this horrendous nuclear conflagration, and millions of other people are driven underground to survive in mass bunkers, which are the size of cities under the ground. There are broadcasts from the military and the government on the surface of how horrific conditions are and how desolate and unsurvivable the surface of planet Earth is after this nuclear cataclysm. Anyway, the protagonist, the hero of the book, happens to stumble onto the surface of the Earth and realize that this is simply not the case. In fact, the surface of the Earth is a lush green paradise only inhabited by the handfuls of the elite, while the general population have been driven to live underground and work in thankless, horrid factories, building robots and other conveniences for the elite who live on the surface in absolute luxury, the useless eaters and the general population out of the way. Very interesting book. I'm not going to spell out all the implications there for you. I think you are smart enough to Make your own conclusions, one way or the other. I think that is feast for thought, as they say. Death object exploding the nuclear weapons hoax. I'm sure some of you are going to have opinions one way or the other. Feel free to leave them in the comments. Knock yourselves out. Just wanted to recommend quickly before we go a video I've recommended. Keep in mind, thanks, Annie. Keep in mind, they always want you to be terrified of something. You are much easier to control when you're terrified of something. Anyway, wanted to recommend a video that I found really, really interesting from Computing Forever, a channel that I've recommended before. This Irish fellow, Dave Cullen. I like his work. It's an interview with the Australian Max Egan. Some of you will know him. Some of you may not. The video is entitled Depopulation, Transhumanism, and Rediscovering Humanity. I found it to be an excellent overview. Spicy, not for the faint of heart, but it grapples with all sorts of fascinating concepts in a calm and sober and long-term perspective. I highly recommend it to you. That's about it for All Out of Bubblegum. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your time. And we will see you next time. Thank you, Ed. Carry on. Till next time. Yes, that's right, Ed. You're absolutely right. 1 p.m. next week, we will need to have a change of schedule because the No Goat show will be on the road. That's right. We will be in Crook next Wednesday, the 27th. So All Out of Bubblegum will be running a little bit earlier that day. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, everyone, for watching. All Out of Bubblegum, signing off.